Well, welcome to everybody. I thought this would be a good topic for internal medicine grand rounds today because it's become topical again. Anybody who's a regular reader of Science magazine, for that matter, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, starting about a year ago, October 2009, there's been quite a controversy stirred up, as you may know, about the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome and potential new etiologic agents that have found. So there's quite a controversy that's brewing, and I'm going to touch upon that briefly during this talk. But I'm mainly going to try to answer these three questions for you, which I think are enormously important as it relates to chronic fatigue syndrome. These are really three hugely important questions. So that's what this grand round is going to be about. Number one, is chronic fatigue syndrome real? Second question, well, what causes fatigue? What's the mechanism behind this main symptom of that syndrome, fatigue? One of the most important symptoms that we see patients with in internal medicine, fatigue. It's probably second or equal to pain, for example, when patients come to see their internist. So it's a hugely important question. What causes that symptom for us? And then the third one, which only 2 or 3 people in this audience know the answer to, is what is the 10th rule of internal medicine? Now, as some of my close colleagues know, I've used the, up until now, the 9 rules of internal medicine as a teaching tool, if you will, for medical decision making for students and residents over the years. But this 10th rule, which is just born now, and actually out of the interview with the patient who you're going to see in just a minute, she gave rise to the genesis of the 10th rule of internal medicine. So in the tradition of grand rounds, we'll start with a patient presentation. This is a patient, I got to know, a very special patient when she was a resident at Hennepin County Medical Center when I was there. One of the best and brightest, wonderful residents that we had in the early 1990s. I didn't know that she went on afterwards to do her fellowship in cardiology and was in a busy cardiology practice, which she loved. And I didn't know about her love for the out of doors, which you will hear during this interview.
I remember thinking at the time, I hope I don't ever get this disease. How could I live without exercise? I didn't think about it again until November of 1997. My passion in life was adventure and medicine, especially practicing cardiology. One of my greatest joys was to expend energy both at work and at play. Since I'm a mountaineer, I call this my descent from the summit with chronic fatigue syndrome. I feel like I collapsed at the peak of my life and have had to find my way down through very difficult and precarious terrain. I was very happy in my career as a cardiologist, and after years of medical training, I had been able to return to my love of mountain climbing, ice climbing, rock climbing, and whitewater kayaking. In fact, I'd been very fortunate in my past to have had the opportunity to climb such peaks as Denali in Alaska, the cane face of Mount Robson in British Columbia, and several peaks in the Juneau ice fields, and rock climbs and ice climbs in the French Alps. At the very most severe state of my illness, I could only stand for about 5 minutes and sit in a chair for about 10 minutes. I wasn't able to tolerate any exercise. I could only climb about a half a flight of stairs before having to stop and rest, and then I would have to crawl on my hands and knees the rest of the way to the top. I had gone from being able to climb 4,000 to 5,000 vertical feet in a day to only being able to climb a half a flight of stairs. I felt like I had a severe flu-like illness every day. I found myself in such a collapsed state that I couldn't even do the very basics of self-care activities. I couldn't drive a car, I couldn't go shopping for groceries or do laundry, I couldn't prepare a simple meal. I was too ill to even read a book or watch television. I remember thinking to myself that I could no more will myself to feel a sense of energy and vigor than a paralyzed person could will themselves to walk. At this point, I've improved a little bit to the place where I can now stand for about 10 minutes and do simple activities. I can sit up in a chair for 30 to 60 minutes. I can prepare a simple meal. I can walk on the treadmill for about 1 minute twice a day. And I can now climb a flight of stairs without having to stop and rest. I now am able to concentrate to the point that I can read a book for about 30 minutes and watch television for about 1 to 2 hours.
So this, you got a pretty good idea of a rather typical history of patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. I saw this patient in 1998. This was 10 years into our chronic fatigue syndrome research program, which I'll tell you about. And we're going to end with another brief excerpt from that interview at the very end. So before getting to these three questions, it's important, of course, to know what we're talking about, chronic fatigue syndrome. What is this syndrome? What do we know about it, etc. So now this was the case definition in 1988 that you see here. And this was a CDC-sponsored case definition. The main symptom is debilitating fatigue that has to be present for at least 6 months. In this patient's case, several years at the point that we saw her. And it has to be unrelieved by rest. Very importantly, you need to rule out a number of medical conditions where chronic fatigue is an important symptom, as well as certain psychiatric disorders where the symptom of chronic fatigue is a major problem. So those are the major criteria. The minor criteria of a syndrome are listed here, and these are symptoms that also are in many ways disabling for the patients that have this. A very important one is this exacerbation with modest physical activity. Typically, all of our patients, which I'll review for you briefly, this was a salient feature. It's a sine qua non. If your fatigue isn't made substantially worse with relatively modest physical exertion, you don't have chronic fatigue syndrome. Sleep disturbance, and as mentioned, sleep doesn't relieve this sensation of exhaustion or fatigue, etc. Now, there have been several attempts since 1988 when this first appeared in the Annals of Internal Medicine, this definition for researchers. So we'd all be talking about the same illness. There have been several attempts to refine it and come up with a better case definition for researchers. But basically, it remains very similar to 1988, at least as I see it. It goes by other names. In the United Kingdom, they call it myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME, but we believe it's the same illness or syndrome. Now, what are the medical conditions that it's a really, in this way, for an internist, this is a wonderful differential diagnosis, because chronic fatigue, the sensation of exhaustion, is so common and so important, as we'll get to when we talk about the second question, what causes fatigue? Malignancy, for example, it's the #1 symptom that patients with cancer or cancer chemotherapy have. Chronic infections of all types, autoimmune diseases, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, etc. And neurologic diseases, especially multiple sclerosis, can be the #1 symptom. Endocrine disorders, a number of endocrinopathies. Fatigue is a major symptom. And organ system diseases, essentially failure of all major organ systems. Fatigue becomes a major, major symptom for those patients, whether it's heart failure, liver failure, kidney failure, etc. And then very importantly, especially with psychotic depression, etc., fatigue can be a very important common symptom. Now, in the early years when we started our program, 1988, not surprisingly, the researchers that decided to take this illness, were from disciplines that seemed to be most relevant at the time. Infectious disease, people like myself and others came with the perspective that fatigue, we see it all the time in infectious diseases. Probably the best example is infectious mononucleosis. If anybody's had clinical infectious mono, they can recall you can hardly get out of the bed to go to the bathroom. You feel so exhausted, and you don't get relieved when you sleep at night. So it's a very common symptom. And this was back in the era where cytokines, which we'll get to, were being defined as the mediators that caused a lot of the symptomatology associated with infectious diseases. Stephen Strauss, unfortunately, the late Stephen Strauss at the NIH, in my view, was the lead scientific researcher on chronic fatigue syndrome. Others, William Reeves at the CDC, who came on a little bit later, and very important group in Australia, Andrew Lloyd, Ian Hickey, he's actually a psychiatrist, but Andrew Lloyd, an infectious disease person. And in the Netherlands, a wonderful program, Joost van der Meer at the University of Nijmegen. So infectious disease people got involved because it sounded like it was going to be an infectious disease. And in fact, the first name of the syndrome before 1988 was chronic mononucleosis, or chronic Epstein-Barr virus infection. When it was first seen in Nevada, it was thought to be due to EBV. And then some very important people in general medicine that have led research programs, Tony Komaroff, Deidre Buchwald, Nancy Klimas listed there. And from the discipline of psychiatry or psychology, Mark Demetrak, who was then at the University of Michigan, and very importantly, Simon Wesley in London, the King's College, have contributed very importantly over the years to our thinking about this illness, chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, even though this remains a puzzling illness, as we'll get to, it isn't due to a lack of trying. These data are from Jim Beattie in our library, did a literature search. The journal articles since 1988, of course, that's when the first article appeared with chronic fatigue syndrome in the title. There were a few papers that year, but you can see cumulatively there are well over 3,200 papers, peer-reviewed papers, published during those 2 decades with chronic fatigue syndrome or chronic fatigue in the title. And over 150 books that have been published. So there's been a lot of research activity, people trying to figure out what's going on with these patients. And I should mention that the researchers that I highlighted there, they're only a small group, but a terrific group, are largely we'd call them physician scientists now. They were called back in those days clinical investigators. Or they were clinical epidemiologists, but they were MDs. They were doctors who were trying to help their patients that were suffering with this illness. Now, our program was mainly at Hennepin County Medical Center. Very active, you see, for 12 years. Our main goal was to determine the pathogenesis. What causes these symptoms that the patients have, and particularly this sensation of fatigue or exhaustion. And we tried hard, as you see here. We ultimately entered 390 patients who met those criteria in the Annals of Internal Medicine for the diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome. We did a number of things. One is we were involved in the characterization of the patients in terms of risk factors in the clinical epidemiology. We did randomized clinical trials, 3 of them, placebo-controlled trials that were targeted largely at trying to get at the pathogenesis again. And we did a number of studies of the immune cells of the patients with chronic fatigue syndrome, especially looking at cytokines, which we thought were the culprit molecules, and also brain scans, SPECT scans, to get a sophisticated look at the brain, both before and after exercise. And we even developed a mouse model that we thought would be useful. And you see, this was an interdisciplinary group. We had to turn to all kinds of people for help, as you see listed here. Not only infectious disease clinicians like myself, but in our research laboratory, neuroimmunology research laboratory, some key colleagues, especially development of this mouse model, but the cytokine work. Chun Chow, who is with us, Dr. Hu and Dr. Sheng, who are still with us. But very importantly, to get psychiatry involved with us because of the issue of depression and how much contribution that is. And we had a superb psychiatrist, Carlos Schenk, involved in the evaluation of all the patients that we saw. A neuroendocrinologist, Bert Sharp, very interested in how certain hormones affect immune cells. A neuroradiologist, an allergist, and clinical epidemiologist. Nikki Lurie was with us at Hennepin at the time, and now gone off as the Assistant Secretary of Health Preparedness to try to get a better handle on the epidemiology of these patients. Christine McDonald, the Minnesota Department of Health, etc. So that first question, is chronic fatigue syndrome real, that I posed to you? Well, I think this became a dilemma. I blame these two people here, and we're going to return to them at the end. Descartes, he was the one that said, I think, therefore I am. So that was his idea. And he's credited or blamed, depending upon your philosophy, with separating the brain from the body, Descartes. Okay? And then Newton, he was this guy that was really the father of modern physics, etc., who's really dominated a lot of clinical, medical, scientific thinking since that time. Well, we'll return to them, but I think they started the philosophical debate, if you will. Is it a real syndrome? Well, one of the first things we did was had to turn to Nikki Lurie. I didn't even know there was a clinical epidemiology discipline, because we had to get a handle of, well, when we saw these patients in the clinic, like the patient you saw, these were really ill people. And how do you determine the severity of illness that we were seeing in these patients? Well, she helped us with this, with what has become a very familiar tool, the medical outcome study short form, and use that to assess the functional severity of these patients. Now, this illness impacted so severely on these main measures, physical, social, mental activities, that she had to redesign the scale, because nothing had been seen like this in terms of its functional impact as seen in chronic fatigue syndrome. So there's no question that it had an enormous impact on the people that we were seeing. They could walk on average, these 390 patients, about 3 blocks before having to stop because they felt exhausted. And these were patients like the patient who was presented who used to love exercise. They were typically exercisers. That's how they got their joy in life for many of them. When we saw them and they came into our clinical program, they had been sick on average about 3.5 years with this illness. But very importantly, we found that about 20%, 1 in 5, recovered back to normal health. So it's important for anybody with this illness to know that that is certainly a possibility. Even though we can't predict to this day who and when that's going to happen, it is a real hope for everybody. Now, one of the things that complicated our thinking with this syndrome were a number of other idiopathic, that is, we don't know the cause, disorders where fatigue is very common as a symptom, and you see them listed here: fibromyalgia, chronic widespread pain syndrome, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic Lyme disease, Gulf War syndrome, where fatigue is a prominent symptom, but it's not necessarily the key symptom that's disabling the patients, and that's the main distinction. But these were and are also remain idiopathic and disturbing, disabling in some cases. Illnesses. It became clear shortly after people got involved that, not surprisingly, this isn't indeed brand new. Simon Wesley has got a very nice article on neurasthenia, described in the 19th century as the first chronic fatigue syndrome epidemic, if you will. So it wasn't really brand new, but it had surfaced that we just hadn't recognized it, interestingly, in the recent past. Well, what about the epidemiology? It's estimated 1 to 2 million Americans suffer with chronic fatigue syndrome. It became clear very rapidly, too, as I've mentioned, some of the major programs, research programs, have been in Europe, not only the Netherlands, but Belgium and the United Kingdom, and in Australia, and now in more recent years being described in articles from China as well as Brazil. So it's a global illness. The best epidemiology, though, has been from Simon Wesley in the UK and William Reeves at the CDC. And what they've shown is that all of the early epidemiology, including ours, was incorrect. We suffered from referral bias. That is, most of the patients we saw were self-referred. They had been seen on average by 3 or 4 doctors, hadn't been given an answer. They were going to get an answer to why they were so sick. So they were largely self-referred. And that was the case for all the research programs early on. And we had the idea this was a disease that you were at risk of if you were very active and a professional and all of those things. But this was a bias, a referral bias, because they've gone out into the community and taken surveys. And somewhat surprisingly, they find that actually, as you see here, African and Native Americans are at increased risk, that people from lower middle socioeconomic backgrounds are at a greater risk than upper. That is, this early idea, this was, quotes, yuppie flu, a term that the patients hated, is wrong. It's actually more common in people that are out in the community, not coming to see us in suffering with this. And Simon Wesley showed similar incidents in 2 cities that are quite different, quite diverse, London and Sao Paulo, if you go out and you look for it in the field, if you will. So the question number 1, is chronic fatigue syndrome real? Of course it's real. There's no question that it's real. This is a disabling illness for many patients that have it. Just because we don't understand it doesn't mean it's not real. So that's an issue that shouldn't be an issue at all. But for the patients, it remains a nagging problem for them. They have a real illness that we need to figure out. No doubt it's heterogeneous and it's complex, but that doesn't mean that it's not real. Now that's number 1. Is chronic fatigue syndrome real? Of course it's real. And now a very important question, and I think it's actually the key question, and felt that from the very beginning when we started this program, and told my colleague Chun Chow, if you can come up with the mechanism for fatigue, chronic fatigue, the biochemistry, you'll get a Nobel Prize for that, because it's so hugely important in clinical medicine. We have to figure out what makes people feel fatigued, what causes, what's the mechanism for fatigue. Now, if I were to take a survey of the audience, this has been done many times, roughly 40% of Americans at any point in time say they feel tired or fatigued. And that's why all these energy drinks, presumably, that you can get at the grocery store and you name it, are so popular. Everybody is feeling tired, right? And so that's a very common symptom. But we're not talking about that kind of tired unless you have chronic fatigue syndrome and you're here. When you look up the definition in the Webster Dictionary, fatigue is either a weariness or exhaustion from labor, exertion, or stress, or it's the temporary loss of power in a muscle. Well, we're talking about pathologic fatigue. That is the sensation of exhaustion at rest. You didn't do anything to make you feel that way. And it's prolonged. It doesn't go away. And in the case of chronic fatigue syndrome, at least, it's exacerbated by physical activity or other forms of stress. That's the fatigue we're talking about here. Now, in terms of, well, how common is that symptom? There have been several surveys done of primary care, internal medicine clinics over the years, and roughly the same answer comes up. About 20% of patients who are coming to your primary care clinic have fatigue as or certainly a major symptom. When you ask them, why do you feel ill? It's that sensation of fatigue. Now, about half of those patients, you can figure it out. They have one of those diseases that we need to eliminate before we can use the name chronic fatigue, or terms chronic fatigue syndrome. So they'll have infections, in particular Epstein-Barr virus or chronic hepatitis. And there are a lot of other infections that we know, not too many that give you that symptom for 6 months or longer, infectious diseases without getting a diagnosis. But it's a very common cause of fatigue in patients coming to primary care clinics. as I already mentioned, cancer. It's said to be the #1 symptom in cancer patients or patients on cancer chemotherapy, a sensation of exhaustion or fatigue. And in fact, most of the really good research on chronic fatigue, I think, in the last several years has been coming out of the cancer field because cancer patients are disabled by that symptom. Now, rheumatologists know this is a very common symptom in lupus patients, rheumatoid arthritis. It can be, in fact, the main symptom that's ruining the life of people with collagen vascular diseases. Multiple sclerosis, it's the #1 symptom for many patients with MS. And as I already mentioned, chronic end-stage organ system disease, whether it's of your heart, liver, lung, kidneys, it's a major symptom, chronic fatigue. And then about half of the other patients, you can't figure out a cause. They have idiopathic illness, and it will likely be chronic fatigue syndrome. So it's a very, very common symptom. Well, there have been a number of hypotheses about, well, what does cause chronic fatigue syndrome? And as I already mentioned, in infectious diseases, it's a very common symptom. Anybody that's had the flu recently knows how you feel. It's exhausted. You want to go to bed and rest, but you get better. So it's a very common symptom. And we believe that mediators, cytokines, drive a lot of the symptoms and behavior related to an acute infectious disease. So that hypothesis made a lot of sense to many of us in infectious diseases. And neuroendocrinologists have done many studies, neuropsychiatrists, and neuroscientists. So there have been a number of hypotheses that have been pursued in terms of what's causing this illness called chronic fatigue syndrome. And I should point it out, as in the patient presented, it usually starts with an acute infectious disease-like episode, a viral-like infection, and 6 months later, we don't know what's going on, and they have chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, because infectious diseases have been implicated, not only recently, but in the past, these are the organisms, there are 22 of them, historically over the last century, that have been implicated as causing an illness that was very similar to what we now call chronic fatigue syndrome. Probably historically most important for our infectious disease group, Wesley Spink, who was a international researcher on brucellosis. As many of you may know, this was chronic brucellosis is what he called it back in those days. So a lot of bacteria, and not surprisingly, as viruses have become more and more recognized in recent years, many viruses, I mentioned Epstein-Barr virus, where it was thought to be the etiology, but by 1988 it was clear it wasn't the etiology. So a number of viruses have been proposed, and most recently, and that's where the controversy has steamed up, are these retroviruses called xenotropic murine leukemia virus-related virus and murine leukemia virus as potential etiologic agents. Now, as indicated in this Lancet article, there's a huge controversy. Well, what are these viruses? Are they really the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome or not? Has it gone viral? Well, this is the paper in Science that had the patients so excited because now finally those doctors will believe me. I've got this virus. This was a study done at the University of Nevada, and you can see there were, in this cohort of patients, 67% of patients that were found to have evidence, serologically or by culture, of this retrovirus, this murine leukemia virus, XRMV, versus only 3.7% of healthy controls. So this is where the controversy started. All of a sudden, a newly recognized human pathogen from mice as a potential cause of chronic fatigue syndrome. Well, that was followed very quickly, within 2 or 3 months, by publications from the UK and elsewhere. Not a trace. Couldn't find a trace of that virus. This was a virus initially implicated in a rare form of prostatic cancer, but they couldn't find a trace of it. And then all of a sudden this paper appeared, a study done of a cohort of patients from the Harvard group, Tony Komaroff, done at the NIH by a terrific group there, Harvey Alter, where they found, in fact, a different retrovirus, also a murine leukemia retrovirus than the initial virus, but it was found in a very high percentage. In this case, it was 87% of the patients in that cohort versus only 3 or 4% of the healthy controls. So all of a sudden, another retrovirus, a different one, but related one, that was reported from a very, very good group. Well, this is the most recent publication in our Journal of Infectious Diseases, where there are several other negative studies. And the recommendation, which I think is very sound in this editorial, the current status of this virus and related retroviruses, not only in chronic fatigue syndrome, but in prostate cancer, is reach for a scorecard, not a prescription pad. So we don't know. Well, how do you explain that? How could they find this virus in some cohorts and not in others? And there now is going to be a prospective multi-center study to try to sort this out. But for the moment, we don't know what causes chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, I mentioned we set up an animal model. Of course, clinical investigators to test hypotheses, and we were interested in this cytokine hypothesis and need an animal model. And it turns out we turned to the mouse because there were a lot of reagents related to cytokines. And it turned out, we found out in the process of this study, a healthy BELB-C female mouse will run on average 4 miles a night if you give her a chance. You put one of these running wheels in a cage. In fact, this is when I started my jogging, my exercise. It must be good for you. If a mouse is doing it, it's not because they're stupid. They don't think they're getting out of the cage. Must be something good coming from this, right? Well, we found that if we gave them an immune challenge with a bacterial antigen that we knew would elicit a cytokine response, that these mice quit running. And in fact, we could find in their brains the expression of TNF and other cytokines in the brain, in the microglial cells, which happen to be the cells that we were mainly interested in. There's many of those in your brain as there are neurons. And it supported the idea that cytokines were involved. But the model wasn't any good. These mice all got better. After about a month, they were up and running 4 miles a night again. So it wasn't a terribly good mouse model. So question 2, what causes fatigue? We don't know. It's really amazing when you think about it. Such an important symptom in clinical medicine that nobody knows the mechanism, the biochemical mechanism or the mechanism of fatigue in any of these diseases. And now we had a simple idea. We thought it was cytokines triggered by any number of infectious agents. But as Mencken said, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. I think our hypothesis is still good, but we haven't been able to support it or prove it. So now the last question, what is the 10th rule of internal medicine? Again, which originated because of this patient who I presented. Now, before we get to it, of course, what do patients want? You know, when they came to see me, I'd explain to them our hypothesis, and it made a lot of sense to me. They were okay, you know, but they're looking for a cure. They want to get rid of that sensation, that disabling fatigue. They want to be cured, in fact. As pointed out by Martin Fisher, the patient does not care about your science. What he wants to know is, can you cure him? Now, it turns out there have been a number of trials, as you see here, randomized clinical trials of a number of conventional therapies, antivirals and immunoglobulin G. That was our first study. Anti-inflammatory drugs, as you see here, antidepressants, etc. And in a meta-analysis, none of this turns out to be significant in terms of benefit to the patients. The only therapies, these behavioral therapies, which have shown statistical benefit for some patients, are cognitive behavioral therapy which is a form of psychotherapy, and graded, gradual, individualized exercise therapy. But it's only some patients that benefit. So we've been trying. There are a lot of investigators that have been trying to come up with a therapy. So what's our role as doctors, as internists, as primary care physicians? We don't have a cure. But my view is we play a very important role for these patients. The 4 H's, if you will. One is we have to listen to them. We know they're struggling with this illness. I think we have to be honest. We have to tell them we don't know the cause. We don't know why you're suffering. Medical science is working on it. We have to be honest and humble. We play a very important role in the healing, which we'll end up with. And as I already mentioned, hope. 20% of the patients get better on their own. And I think there will be therapy coming given the science that's going on. Now, I recommend to you a very good book, actually, that I've read recently. It's Esther Sternberg, who's at the National Institutes of Health at the NIMH. She's a rheumatologist by background, but it's called Healing Spaces, and the Science of Place and Well-Being. And she makes a wonderful case for a healing space, and there are all kinds of healing spaces for patients who are suffering with any chronic medical problem, not just chronic fatigue syndrome. It's a much better term than we thought initially when we saw these patients. We knew they had a real illness, and we knew they needed help from somebody with coping with a chronic illness. Well, this is a better term, healing, than coping. And I recommend this book very highly to you because I think she's absolutely right. Now, I want to report. The good news is with the patient that I presented, she's found a healing space. It turns out that she stumbled on this on her own, that she decided she needed to get a horse. And this is her horse, on her horse, Cold Dancer. And this horse, when you talk to her, has made a huge difference in terms of healing. She's not cured, but she is healing. And she's also moved, I should say, out of Minnesota. That's not a bad idea. To a wonderful area of the country where there's an ocean and there are trees and beauty, etc. So she's found a healing space. And it does appear that this horse plays a very interesting role in healing, something I knew nothing about. That's a topic for another grand rounds. But it's a huge area, actually, of alternative medicine, if you will. Now, to get back to Descartes and Newton, this is the philosopher that had it right, at least according to Heinrich Wolff, who is at the University of Copenhagen, gastroenterologist, who was asked to write one of the essays for the Millennium issue, turn of the millennium, for the Lancet. And this was the article he wrote, The Concept of Disease from Newton back to Aristotle. And this is what he forecast now for the new millennium. Aristotle recognized the creativeness of nature, focused on qualities rather than quantities, and on description rather than measurement. This view of nature must appeal to all biologically minded medical scientists, but for centuries it was largely ignored as it was incompatible with the Newtonian view. He suggests that we shall no longer regard disease as a mechanical fault, like Newton would have proposed, in the human machine, but as a disturbed life process. We shall apply the theories of open systems and nonlinear dynamics to medical problems, and we shall reach a fuller understanding of the development of disease. We shall use our new knowledge to invent new effective therapies, but we must not harbor the illusion that we shall ever be able to eradicate disease. So I think he's right. I think we have to return to Aristotle and his concept of disease. It's in Newton, the mechanical model is not correct. Well, what about Descartes? He was the one that separated the mind and the body. This is another book that's really very worthwhile reading by Antonio Damasio, a neurologist, terrific neurologist, on Descartes' error. And he pointed out Descartes, he was the one that said, I think, therefore I am. The error was not true. This isn't true because, in fact, when you think about it, The non-thinking brain, the so-called emotional brain, or the subcortex, the limbic system, drives most behavior. Anybody that goes into a meeting and sees human behavior, that's not the thinking brain. There's a lot going on that has nothing to do with the cognitive thinking brain. It's the emotional brain that defines who you are. So Descartes had it wrong too, not just Newton. And this is where I think the science is going to come, because the brain is indeed, if you think about it, all symptoms have to be generated in the brain. You're not going to have a symptom unless it relates to neurochemistry and the brain. The problem is the brain is very complex. A network of more than 100 billion interconnected nerve cells, neurons, more than 40 different neurotransmitters, changes in the balance. But this is the area of science where the answers, I think, or the answer to fatigue, for example, is going to come from, because it's becoming much more sophisticated in terms of understanding the brain and the interaction between the subcortex and the cortex. Now we're going to get to Rule 10. What did this patient inspire? Well, this is also part of medical history. Sir William Osler, who founded our discipline, internal medicine, he said the practice of medicine is an art based on science. And another book that should be mandatory for all our medical students, Francis Peabody, The Caring Physician. He said, for the secret of the care of the patient isn't caring for the patient. So that's Rule 10. Caring is always an important medicine, an old idea.
The first thing I'd like to say to my colleagues about chronic fatigue syndrome is that it's absolutely essential that they listen to their patients and believe in what they say to them. The first physician I saw wrote a letter to my employers saying to them that I might have chronic fatigue syndrome, but then proceeded to say 3 times in the same letter that he couldn't exclude depression as the etiology. This created great difficulty for me with my cardiology colleagues, as well as with the disability companies. I would really recommend that if they are concerned at all about depression as an etiology, that they refer their patients to a psychiatrist who has experience with chronic fatigue syndrome. The second thing I'd like to say is that because this disease seems to carry such a stigma with it, that patients really need their physicians as an advocate. I have really needed my physician to advocate for me to my friends and families, to my employers, to disability companies, as well as to other physicians. I've gotten the impression when I've seen other physicians that they don't really understand how ill I've been, and some physicians still don't seem to think that this is a disease that really exists. I think the last thing that I would like to say to physicians is that the doctor-patient relationship is extremely important. I know that this is true for myself and for other patients with chronic fatigue syndrome that I have spoken to. I know that when I return from a visit to my physician, I play over and over again in my mind the things that were said to me, as well as the attitude that was shown to me during the visit. The kindness and compassion that physicians can show to their patients with chronic fatigue syndrome will really provide comfort and strength to their patients. I think the last thing that I'd like to say in completing this interview is to everyone in the audience to enjoy and savor every moment of the energy and vitality and vigor that you feel as you go through your days. It's one of your most precious gifts, and it's what I and other patients with chronic fatigue syndrome have lost.